I've been working with elderly people for 15 years. And if there's one thing this time has taught me, it's that what weighs the most at the end of life is almost never what shows on the outside. It's not the cane, not the struggle to get out of bed, not the medication that has to be taken on time. What weighs the most is what stays buried inside Dot, and that doesn't show up during the day, in the middle of routine, when people are coming and going, when family is around, trying to cheer them up when someone asks, "Are you okay?" And the answer comes automatically, "I'm fine." It's not in those moments. These things, they slip out in the in-between. I've lost count of how many times it's happened the same way. I walk into the room just to adjust something, a pillow, a sheet, some medication, and I'm met with a silence that feels heavier than usual. The TV is off, the window slightly open, letting in that faint late afternoon light. And the person is there, staring at a fixed point, as if they were somewhere else entirely. Sometimes I don't even need to ask anything. I just stay there, for a few more seconds, and the words come, quiet, almost like a thought that slipped out by accident. "Funny. We always think we have time, don't we? Or, I did so much, but it feels like I left the most important things for later." And what always strikes me isn't just what they say, it's how they say it. There's no anger, no exaggerated drama. It's a kind of quiet realization, as if, at that point, there's no use arguing with life anymore, only observing it. There was one man, I remember him to this day, who stayed silent for a few minutes before saying anything. I was organizing his medication, and he just kept looking at the closed door. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "I thought I was doing everything right." And he stopped. Didn't finish the sentence. Didn't explain. But he didn't have to. The way he said it already carried everything. At the beginning of my career, I used to hear these things as individual stories, each person with their own past, their choices, their paths. I respected that, of course, but I didn't connect the dots. But as the years went by, those moments started to pile up in my mind. The same pauses, the same distant looks, the same feeling that something was being said, but never completely. And that's when it started to bother me. Because it didn't matter if it was someone who lived a simple life, or someone who built a lot, whether they had a present family or were almost completely alone. There was always that moment when the mask slipped just a little. And in that moment, they spoke. Not clearly, not directly, but enough to leave a question hanging in the air that began to follow me. Why do so many different people at such similar moments in life start saying such similar things? At first, I thought it was just my impression, that I was being too sensitive or maybe taking those words more seriously than I should. After all, everyone has their own story. It would be natural to hear similar things from time to time. But it wasn't from time to time. It was too often. And it wasn't just the content. It was the way. The pauses, the tone, the moment when it came out. Always in that quiet gap, always when no one else was really there to listen. As if those words needed a specific kind of space to exist. I started paying closer attention. There was a woman who always had visits from her children. Her family was present, loving, never left her alone for too long. During visits she smiled, talked, even joked. But one day after everyone had left, I went back into the room to close the window. And I found her different. The smile was gone. She was looking at her hands, slowly running her fingers over them, as if counting something invisible. And then she said, very quietly, "I should have lived more for myself." No one had asked anything. There was no context. It was just that, slipping out. A few days later, another man. Completely different from her. Simple life, little education, almost no family around, said something that stuck with me. I kept waiting for the right moment, but it feels like it never came. And when he said that, I felt something strange, because in some way it echoed what that woman had said. It wasn't the same, but it carried the same feeling, and then it started happening again, and again, and again. I thought I still had time. I prioritized so many things, and today I don't even know why. I didn't think it would end like this. So quickly. Different sentences. Different people. Completely different lives. But there was an invisible thread connecting it all. And the more I heard, the harder it became to ignore. It wasn't coincidence. It couldn't be. Because those words didn't come loaded with exaggerated guilt. They came with a kind of late clarity, as if only at that point in life certain things finally made sense, but without the chance to go back. And what marked me the most was realizing that no one said these things in an organized way. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a complete reflection. They were fragments of a bigger truth that even they still seemed to be trying to understand. And that's when I started putting those fragments together inside myself. Not as a professional, but as someone who was hearing the same message, broken into pieces, coming from different directions. And the more those fragments piled up, the more an uncomfortable feeling grew. If so many different people were saying such similar things, then maybe it wasn't about each person's story. Maybe it was about something far more common than we'd like to admit. Over time, I stopped hearing those sentences as isolated moments, and began to see a pattern that went beyond the words. It wasn't just what they said. It was what remained after they finished speaking. A different kind of silence, because every story was unique. I've cared for people who had everything: money, recognition, travel, a life that from the outside seemed complete. And I've also cared for those who lived with the bare minimum, who spent their whole lives just trying to get by. People surrounded by children, grandchildren, constant visits, and others who went days without anyone walking through that door. But in the end, something always met in the middle. I remember a man who had been a businessman, always very sharp, organized. He liked talking about his achievements, the tough decisions he had to make. He spoke with pride. But it wasn't a light kind of pride. It was almost as if he were trying to convince himself that it had all been worth it. On one of those quieter days, he was staring at the shelf in his room, where his family had placed some old photos. He recognized all of them. Pointed, said names, remembered dates. But suddenly he stopped at one specific photo and said nothing for a few seconds. Then he said, "I was there, but I wasn't really there." It hung in the air in a strange way, because it wasn't about the photo. It was about his entire life. In another room, another story. A simple woman who had dedicated her life to her children, never worked outside the home, always put her family first. Everyone praised her for that. She was seen as an example. But one afternoon, while I was helping her sit more comfortably in bed, she grabbed my arm with a strength I didn't expect and said, "I did everything for them, but I think I forgot about myself." And she let go slowly, as if that sentence had come out heavier than she expected. Two completely different lives, opposite paths, choices that, at first glance, had nothing in common, but the feeling was the same. And it wasn't just those two cases. It was recurring, frighteningly recurring. People who rushed through life, and people who never really moved. People who chose stability, and others who risked everything. People who lived surrounded by others, and those who learned to deal with loneliness. In the end, Many of them arrived at a very similar place. It wasn't exactly sadness. It wasn't despair. It was a quieter kind of emptiness. Harder to explain. As if something essential had been left behind along the way. Not out of malice. Not even out of conscious neglect. But because it always seemed like it could be dealt with later. And that later simply never came. That's when I stopped trying to understand each story separately. Because it no longer made sense to look at them case by case. The question inside me changed. It was no longer what happened to this person. It became, what is happening to almost all of them? It took me years to put this into words. Because at first, it felt unfair to reduce so many different lives to a single explanation. It was more comfortable to believe that each case was unique, that each regret had its own origin, but it didn't. What I have been hearing, piece by piece over all those years, was actually the same story being told in different ways, and it almost never came complete, though no one said it directly. No one sat down and said, "The mistake of my life was this." No, that never happened. What existed were fragments, loose sentences, looks that lingered a little longer than usual, silences that carried more meaning than any long explanation. Until one day, without even realizing it, it all came together. Inside me, not as a rational conclusion, but as a feeling impossible to ignore. Almost everyone, almost all of them, were talking about the same thing. They had lived on autopilot for too long. Not in the sense of a careless or irresponsible life. On the contrary, many did everything right. They worked, took care of their families, fulfilled their roles, followed expectations. They were good people, responsible, present, but at some point, they stopped listening to themselves. They postponed decisions that mattered, swallowed their desires, convinced themselves that certain things could wait. A dream, a conversation, a change, an apology, a different choice. There was always a reasonable excuse. Now isn't the time. I'll deal with it later. First I need to take care of what's urgent. And life just kept moving. The problem isn't that they chose wrong. It's that, many times, they didn't even realize they were choosing. They just followed the flow, responded to demands, did what seemed necessary, until one day, looking back, they realized they had spent more time reacting than actually deciding. That is what hurts the most. Because you can't point to a single mistake and say it was here. There's no clear moment to fix. There's no villain. There's no outrageous decision that explains everything. Something much quieter. A whole life built without enough pauses to ask, does this still make sense for me? And when that question finally appears, it comes along with another, much heavier one. Why didn't I stop sooner? I've heard that question in so many different ways, that now, when someone stays silent for too long, staring into nothing, I know exactly what's going on inside. It's not confusion. It's late clarity. And maybe the hardest thing to accept is that this regret doesn't come from big tragedies. It comes from small postponed choices, repeated over years. And when that clarity finally arrives, it's not like people imagine. There's no despair, no shouting, no dramatic scene of regret exploding all at once. What comes is a different kind of silence. I've been in many rooms at that moment. You can tell when it happens. The person is no longer confused, no longer trying to understand what they feel. On the contrary, it seems like, for the first time, everything makes sense, just too late. Their gaze changes. It's no longer that lost look, searching for answers. It's a steadier, quieter gaze, as if they were revisiting their own life with a clarity they never had before. And sometimes one last sentence comes. Short, unadorned. It went by fast. Or, I thought I still had time. And the hardest part is that there's not much you can say in response. Because at that point, they're no longer asking for a solution. They're not waiting for comfort. They already understand. And that understanding isn't desperate. It's final. I remember a woman who, after days of barely speaking, called me over just to adjust her pillow. When I finished, she held my hand calmly, without urgency, and said, "If I could, I would have just paused more often to feel life as it was happening." There was no bitterness in her voice, no anger. Just a simple truth that took a lifetime to surface. And that's what stays with you the most. Because once they understand, there's no more attempt to fix things. No list of what they would do differently. No promises to change. There's acceptance, but not the light, peaceful kind. It's an acceptance that carries weight. The weight of knowing life was lived more on autopilot than in presence. And even so, they go on, breathing, looking out the window, receiving visits, living the days they still have, now with an awareness that, if it had come earlier, might have changed everything. And it's impossible to leave those rooms without carrying something with you. Because after hearing this so many times, after seeing this same clarity emerge in so many different people, it becomes hard to pretend this has nothing to do with those who are still in the middle of their journey. Maybe the most honest thing I can say, after these 15 years, is that this kind of regret is not rare. It is quietly common. And the only difference between those who already feel it and those who don't yet is the amount of time that still exists before that silence arrives.